Rome raised not art, but barely kept alive, and with old Greece unequally did strive, till Goths and Vandals, a rude northern race, did all the matchless monuments deface. That is a quote from a poem by John Dryden, who was England's first poet laureate from 1694. In the long history of humanity, there have been some events so unexpected, destructive, and or transformative that people lacked the words to describe what had happened, and so new words had to be invented to describe these events because old words proved wholly inadequate to describe the scale or the importance of what had happened. This is what happened in the 17th and 18th centuries as thinkers of the European Enlightenment reappraised the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. This is when we start to see books like Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire come out, for example. Scholars like Gibbon believed that Rome was the epitome of civilization, that it was a bastion of enlightened, rational imperium that was foolishly destroyed by the destructive, unwashed barbarians from the north. While these Enlightenment historians were critical of the Goths and Huns for their role in the collapse of the Roman world, these Enlightenment historians reserved their most vitriolic attacks for another Germanic tribe, and that was the Vandals. The Vandals' impact on the Roman world was so intense that these Enlightenment thinkers came up with a new word to describe what the Vandals had done to the Roman world. These Enlightenment historians believe that the Vandals, who sacked the city of Rome in 455, had engaged in acts of destruction so wanton and so large that there was no existing term to describe it. And so they coined a new term to describe the destruction that the Vandals had wrought. They called it Vandalism. These Enlightenment thinkers were huge Rome fanboys, and as such, their interpretations of the fall of the Roman world are seriously biased. Today, I'm going to try and unpack some of these Enlightenment biases by telling the first part of a two-part story about the Vandal people and the foundation of the Vandal kingdom. And we're going to be covering the period of history from the collapse of the Western Roman Empire to the end of the Vandal Sack of Rome in 455 AD. And then part 2, which should be coming out in the next week, will then cover the Vandal kingdom from the Sack of Rome in 455 AD until the beginning of the Vandal-Byzantine War in 533. I am going to try and tell the story of the Vandals from the perspective of the Vandals themselves. I want to describe events that we cover in this episode from the Vandal perspective rather than from the Roman perspective. This is an episode on Vandal history. If you want to learn about history from the Roman perspective, there are plenty of other podcasts that cover that Roman perspective. But my focus is on the medieval period, and it's important that we get a really good understanding of the different barbarian early medieval kingdoms to make sure we have a good foundation for tackling the rest of the medieval period. Now, talking about history from the Vandal perspective is not easy, and that's because very few primary sources from the Vandal perspective survive, especially, primary sources from a Vandal perspective before the foundation of the Vandal kingdom in North Africa in the mid-5th century. Unfortunately, modern historians who want to learn about the Vandals have to rely solely on sources written by people with Roman backgrounds. And that means that we have to do a lot of work of trying to figure out what actually happened versus what the Romans said had happened. And the Romans had a lot of cultural bias towards the Vandals. And so there's also a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of melodrama. It can get very difficult to try and sort out what the actual truth of the situation is. By the end of today's episode, I hope to provide you with a basic overview of the history of the Vandals so that you can form your own opinion on whether the Vandals really were the destructive boogeymen of the Roman world that the Enlightenment historians described, or whether they were just people trying to make the best out of a really bad situation and secure a future for their people. The oldest written account of the Vandals comes to us from Pliny the Elder, the Roman natural historian who wrote briefly about the Vandals in the 1st century AD. Pliny provides very little information about the Vandals. He just kind of name drops them. This is perhaps a sign that they were known by name in the Roman world, but people didn't know that much about them. Either that or Pliny thought that they weren't important enough to warrant a longer description. Pliny used the word Vandal as kind of an umbrella term to describe a collection of smaller Germanic tribes that he seemed to believe shared a common heritage that was distinct from other Germanic heritages, like, say, the Gothic or the Allan heritage. These smaller tribes that fell under the Vandal umbrella each had their own unique tribal identities. They probably had different tribal leaders, different kings, and so their political entities were separate from one another. But they did seem to share a common Vandal heritage. How they express this heritage isn't something we know for sure, but if I had to guess, I would say that they had a common language that was distinct from other Germanic languages, and that they probably shared a cultural and mythological heritage. They probably worshipped similar gods, or if not the same gods, and they probably had similar cultural practices, similar dress, produced similar artwork, weapons, that kind of thing. The Vandals are next mentioned in the Roman historian Tacitus's book Germania, which was published in 98 AD. And again, Tacitus had very little to say about the Vandals, aside from the fact that they were one of the larger Germanic groups. The Oxford University translation of Tacitus's Germania notes that the term Vandal may have originated from a Germanic word for wanderer, which gives us some idea for where Pliny and Tacitus may have got the term Vandal from. The Vandals next appear in Roman records during the Marcomannic Wars, and that's the period of time when the Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius was fighting to keep hostile Germanic tribes from crossing the Danube frontier into Roman territory. Some Vandal tribes served with the Romans. They actually served on the side of the Romans as mercenaries. The Romans would do this. They would employ mercenaries. They called them federates or federati. And the idea was that, you could bolster your own forces by hiring mercenaries. And at that point, you're just paying one group of barbarians to kill another group of barbarians. And this was just a great idea for the Romans because it meant that they could preserve their own people and let someone else do the fighting. Anyways, back to the Marcomannic Wars. It does seem that there could have been Vandals on both sides of this conflict. Again, if you want to learn more about the Marcomannic Wars, definitely much more in the Roman historical period than in the medieval one. Mike Duncan's History of Rome, if you want to really get into Roman history, check it out. The Vandals next appear in the historical record in 270 AD, which means there is about a 150-year gap in the historical record where we don't really know what the Vandals are doing. And this is really tough because it means if we want to try and know anything about this 150-year period, we have to make educated guesses. So it's a real challenge for historical researchers who are trying to construct trying to construct a complete Vandal history or like a Vandal cultural portrait during this period of time. Thankfully, after the events of the 3rd century, the Vandals do become important enough to the Roman elite that we start to see Roman authors recording things about the Vandals because the Vandals become an important part of politics in the Roman world. They become an important part of Roman warfare, and they become an important part of religion in the Roman world as well, an important part of those religious debates. In 270, a Vandal warband crossed into modern-day Hungary and started raiding the Roman settlements there. That didn't last very long, though, because the emperor of the Roman Empire in 270 AD was a guy by the name of Aurelian. And if you listened to the third podcast episode that we made as part of this show, you will know that Aurelian was a total badass, military genius of some kind. He managed to reunite the Roman Empire that had been divided into 3 parts. He fought off several barbarian invasions. Aurelian was just a total beast, arguably one of the better Roman emperors, maybe in the top 10. Aurelian's army humiliated the Vandals in battle, but rather than destroy the Vandals, Aurelian forced them to agree to move back across the Danube frontier, and he also forced them to agree to provide a force of 2,000 horsemen to serve in the Roman cavalry. This was a thing the Romans would do if they defeated a tribe or a barbarian group, and they didn't necessarily want to go through all the trouble of trying to exterminate that barbarian group. They would sign a treaty forcing the barbarians to provide a certain military force as mercenaries for the Romans. Making the Vandals become Roman federates was a good strategy in the short term, as it did allow Aurelian to bolster his forces. And Aurelian was fighting off a lot of wars at once, and so he always needed soldiers. However, in the long term, this strategy did prove to be disastrous. Had Aurelian continued to prosecute his war with the Vandals and sought to weaken the Vandals instead of accepting a negotiated settlement that did allow them to maintain some kind of military force, it's possible that the Vandals wouldn't have survived long enough as an independent entity to weaken the Roman Empire in the 4th and 5th centuries. Modern historians tend to think that by the 3rd century, the Vandals had settled down in modern-day Poland. This is because archaeologists discovered some warrior graves dated from the 3rd to the 5th centuries in Poland that they believe may contain the remains of the Vandal people. However, this is uncertain, as there is a smaller group of historians that argue that these graves are Gothic, that they are Gothic burials rather than Vandal burials. I could go over some theories about Vandal culture and history up to that point in 270 when they do re-enter the historical record, but without having any evidence to fall back on, I don't really feel like I want to waste your time with speculation. So what we're going to do now is fast forward to the next appearance of the Vandals in the historical record, and that is in 376 AD, when the Goths rebelled against the Eastern Roman Empire and began a multi-decade rampage across Eastern Roman territory. Saint Jerome, who is most famous for translating the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, wrote in a letter that the Vandals had allied themselves with the Goths and that the Vandals were actually helping the Goths in this revolt. Jerome implied in his letter that the Vandals were either helping the Goths attack Roman settlements or that they were taking advantage of the political chaos caused by the Gothic revolt to make their own attacks and their own raids into Roman territory. Still, the Vandals seem to be a relatively minor force at this point, as Jerome referred to them as supporters of the Goths rather than as an independent force that was important enough to be reckoned with in its own right. Now, at this point in the podcast, you might be getting a little confused. We have talked about a lot of different Germanic groups, the Goths and the Vandals we've talked about a lot already, and you might be wondering how you would even be able to tell a Goth and a Vandal apart by looking at them. They are both Germanic groups, and so they did have some similarities. They may have worshipped the same gods or similar gods. They may have worn clothes that were of similar designs and they may have used the same weapons as well. But with these Germanic groups, it does seem that the biggest distinguishing factor would have been their language. It's possible that the Gothic and Vandal languages were close enough that they were mutually intelligible, but it does seem that they were also different enough that you could tell who was a Goth and who was a Vandal by what language they were speaking or what accent they were speaking with. Obviously, you are going to identify with people who speak your language over people who don't speak your language. And it seems that language was one of the main signifiers of identity among these Germanic tribes. While the Gothic and Vandal languages were probably related, they were still distinct enough for the Goths and Vandals to consider themselves distinct political entities. Unlike the Gothic language, which was preserved thanks to the Gothic translation of the Gospels, the Vandal language has almost entirely disappeared from the historical record, and this is partly because later Vandal rulers preferred to use Latin rather than their native tongue. So all the Vandal records from the 5th and 6th centuries are actually in Latin rather than in the Vandal language. Such was the cultural and linguistic influence of Rome that even the greatest enemies of the Roman Empire came to adopt their language and their political institutions in an attempt to legitimize their rule. In 405 AD, the Gothic king Radagasius invaded Roman Gaul with a mixed Gothic-Vandal army. Radagasius's army made it into Italy, but they were defeated there by the Magister Militum Stilicho, who executed Radagasius. Radagasius's troops were then given a choice. They could work for Stilicho, or they could be killed, and most of them chose to work for Stilicho. Stilicho, interestingly enough, was half Vandal himself. His father seems to have been a Vandal mercenary who took a Roman wife and settled down in Italy. As Magister Militum, Stilicho was the supreme commander of the entire Roman military. Magister Militum is sometimes translated as Generalissimo or Supreme Commander. The idea is Stilicho is basically the head honcho of the Roman military. However, in practice, Stilicho really only had direct control over the Roman forces that were stationed in the Eastern Empire and in Italy, as the Roman armies that were stationed in the western provinces of Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia were opposed to Stilicho's leadership and were actually backing a usurper emperor by the name of Constantine III. And so we see these provinces actually being in open rebellion against the emperor and Stilicho and backing a pretender emperor. Despite Stilicho's half Vandal heritage, it is likely that Stilicho didn't really consider himself to be a Vandal. He was very much integrated with Rome. He was a cultural Roman. It seems that he received some kind of classical education. And he was also willing to take violent action against his father's people, which shows that, yeah, he may have had some Vandal heritage, but he really felt like his loyalty was to Rome. By the turn of the 5th century, the Vandals were absolutely out of luck. And so far, the Vandals, in this podcast, so far every conflict that the Vandals have come into with the Romans, they have lost. So things are not going super well for them. They have been surviving, but they haven't really been achieving any kind of military prowess or real political independence. It does seem they were either being dominated by the Goths or they were being dominated by the Romans. And things get even worse for them when the Huns arrive on the scene at the turn of the 5th century. And so the Vandals are actually pushed by the Huns out of their Polish homeland. It seems some Vandals did probably choose to accept the rulership of the Huns and become mercenaries or slave soldiers for the Huns. Others chose to flee, and the Vandals that chose to flee really had nowhere to flee to except into Roman territory. They fled into Roman territory, some of them seeking the protection of the Romans, the others just trying to steal food so that they didn't starve. The Romans, of course, were not having it. It seems that they wanted to stop the boats, so to speak. Much like the modern European Union, the Romans were not fans of, immigration that was not being strictly controlled. In 406 AD, the Romans dispatched their Frankish allies. The Franks at this point are federates of the Roman military. They dispatched their Frankish allies to block the Vandal entrance into Roman territory. However, the Franks actually lose this fight, and so we see the Vandals claim a real military victory against Rome and its allies for the first time in 406. The Franks did, however, manage to kill the Vandal king before they were forced to retreat, and this did naturally cause some problems for the Vandals. In 407 AD, the Vandals crossed into Roman territory, and this set the stage for the eventual climactic confrontation between the Vandals and the faltering Roman state. However, in 407, the Romans seriously underestimated the Vandal threat. They were much more concerned with the rebellion of the pretender emperor Constantine III, who was at this point preparing to actually invade Gaul with an army that he had raised in Roman Britain. The Vandals were confined to northern Gaul until 409 AD, as after the Emperor Constantine III invaded Gaul and took it over, he diverted some of his army to keep the Vandals contained in northern Gaul, to prevent them from breaking out of northern Gaul and making incursions into southern Gaul. Still, the Vandals are recorded as having carved a path of destruction throughout northern Gaul, robbing, taking prisoners, taking stuff, and seizing land from the Roman citizenry. And the Vandals weren't alone in this. This is what a lot of other barbarian peoples were doing as they had crossed the Rhine and the Danube frontiers. You have to keep in mind these were huge host of hungry, desperate people who were willing to do whatever it takes. And it's not like they really felt particularly charitable to the Romans, who, had probably had some of their fathers, brothers, uncles, or sons killed in one of the various Roman Germanic wars. Back in the Roman world, our boy Stilicho is on the outs. His forces were absolutely depleted by fighting off the repeated barbarian incursions into the empire, and because of this, he had been forced to accept a humiliating peace deal with the Goths to prevent further Gothic incursions into Italy. Worse, Stilicho had completely failed to defeat the rebellion of Constantine III. Constantine III was still very much at large at this point. And so, because of this, a coup d'etat was organized in the Western Roman capital of Ravenna, and the Roman elites captured Stilicho and eventually had him executed. These same Romans, wanting revenge for the barbarian attacks on Roman territory, then went on a murderous rampage across Italy. And it's possible that this was also, taken as a further dig at Stilicho, who was of half barbarian heritage himself. Many barbarian mercenaries who had signed on with the Roman military ended up marrying Roman women, or they settled their families down in Roman territory. Some had Roman wives, half Roman children that were living in Italy. While these mercenaries were away from home, protecting Rome, protecting Italy, guarding the empire and guarding the imperial frontiers, the Roman elite betrayed them and murdered the families of as many as 30,000 barbarian mercenaries. So that was really, really crappy of them. How do you think your mercenaries are going to respond once they get the news that you had their wife and kids murdered? Well, most of them defect. They defect from the Roman military, and they join up with this really promising Gothic general by the name of Alaric. We've talked about Alaric before in this podcast because Alaric leads a mixed barbarian army consisting largely of Goths, possibly of Alans and Vandals as well, in the Sack of Rome in 410 AD, which was the first time in 800 years that Rome had been sacked. Like I said, it is likely that there were some Vandals that served with Alaric, but the main force of Vandals were still trapped in northern Gaul at this point. Things started to turn around for the Vandals in 409 AD as Constantine III's rebellion began to disintegrate. Constantine was ultimately defeated by Emperor Honorius, who was the legitimate Roman emperor. Honorius defeated Constantine, and Constantine was killed in battle. The rebellion disintegrated, and this actually gave the Vandals an opportunity to break out of northern Gaul, which they did. And they moved out of northern Gaul into southern Gaul and expanded their campaign of destruction there. Saint Paulinus, who was the bishop of the city of Nour in southern France, actually wrote a very moving piece of poetry describing the effects of the Vandal onslaught on the local population. And it's a really interesting window into how people who are living through these barbarian invasions would have felt about it. So I'm actually going to read a little bit here. Yet, while Sarmatians waste and Vandals brawl and Alans ravish, we have set our will with hopes ambiguous and sick efforts still on building ruins to a world we've lost. The grief that Paulinus feels here is palpable. There does seem to be a real sense here that Paulinus is watching the world that he grew up with. He's watching the empire that he was told would be eternal crumble. He is watching the promise of Rome, which, he would have venerated as a great Christian, universal empire. He's watching that empire crumble, and so his grief is really palpable And it's a really, really interesting look at how the Roman people who are on the receiving end of a lot of these barbarian attacks are feeling about it. There is actually a later medieval legend, which was repeated in the 6th century by Pope Gregory the Great, who, on top of being a really good pope, also did seem to have kind of a problematic relationship with the truth. He makes a lot of historical claims about various biblical figures or saints that it seems that he either made up or he, took from some legend that isn't really substantiated in the historical record. Another example of this is his now infamous claim that Mary Magdalene was a prostitute, when there's no evidence of this in the historical record or in the Bible. In this later medieval legend, Saint Paulinus is approached by a woman whose son had been taken captive by the Vandals. And according to this legend, Paulinus had already depleted his church's treasury by ransoming other people who had been taken captive by the Vandals. This was a common thing that churches did, is if members of their community were kidnapped by invaders, the churches would put up some of the money to ransom the members of the congregation. And so you do see the church kind of acting as something of a social safety net for people that are being taken captive. Anyways, according to this legend, Paulinus is absolutely bankrupt. He's broke. He's got no money. And rather than turn this poor mother away, who just wants her son to be rescued from the Vandals, who, by the way, are Christians, but they're heretic Christians, and so there's also concern for her son's soul at this point. She's just so concerned about her son. Paulinus can't turn her away, and so what Paulinus does is he travels to the king of the Vandals, he meets with the king of the Vandals, and he offers himself up in exchange for this boy. And the Vandals accept, and so Paulinus is turned into the gardener for the Vandal king. But later on, the Vandal king discovers that his gardener is actually the legendary and saintly Bishop Paulinus of Nor, and so out of respect for Paulinus's holiness, out of respect for Paulinus's position as a bishop, he decides to set Paulinus free. This story is probably just a legend. There's not really any historical basis for this, but the fact that people told this story about Paulinus shows us that he was regarded as being especially kind and as being especially saintly, and so people tried to tell stories that reflected that. I may do a longer episode later on about the life of Saint Paulinus. He is one of the few poets we have who actually wrote quite a few surviving poems about what it was like to live through the collapse of the Roman world and also experience the dawn of the new barbarian and or medieval era. Let's get back to the Vandals here. This is an episode about the Vandals after all. In 409 AD, after kind of worming their way through southern Gaul, the Vandals cross the Pyrenees into northern Hispania, where they continued attacking Roman settlements and taking Roman citizens prisoner. Right at the same time, Roman Spain was hit by a simultaneous plague and a famine. So things were looking pretty bleak for the Roman citizens living there. Without any real Roman army left to block the Vandal advance, the Vandals were able to seize a large portion of Hispania, and Hispania was actually carved up into a lot of various different kingdoms by other barbarian tribes, the Goths and the Alans specifically. Still, the Western Roman court continued to underestimate the Vandals, even as the Vandals had, rampaged their way through Gaul, settled down in northern Spain, and were establishing a position there. The Romans are underestimating this. And so the Vandals actually reach out to the Roman court, and they offer a peace deal if the Romans will promise to recognize Hispania as the new Vandal homeland. Basically, give the Vandals a plot of fertile land that they can farm, and they'll be allies to the Roman Empire. They'll be tributaries of the Romans. All they want is Roman recognition of their land in Hispania. But the Roman court refuses to consider it. These Romans did not want any of the land of their beloved empire being turned over to barbarians. You do have to remember that Romans really considered themselves to kind of be the epitome of human civilization, and so they absolutely disdained barbarian peoples. They really, really looked down on Germanic peoples in particular. It took a special kind of arrogance and a strong sense of cultural superiority to ignore the obvious threat that the Vandals had posed to the Roman state. And it may have been the smart thing to come to some kind of accommodation with the Vandals. However, the Romans were so confident in their superiority that they ended up provoking the Vandals at every turn. Rather than give up a portion of Hispania for the Vandals to live, the Romans dispatched an army of Roman soldiers and Gothic mercenaries to reconquer the province. The Vandal king at this point is a guy by the name of Gunderic, and Gunderic was really committed to the idea of permanently settling his people down in Spain. It makes sense. His people had been forced to truck halfway across Europe over a period of about 50 years, and so it makes sense that he would want to establish a permanent homeland where they could settle down, they could fortify, they could start raising crops instead of plundering all the time for supplies. When the Goths and the Romans showed up in Spain trying to reconquer the province, obviously that conflicted with Gunderic's vision for a Vandal kingdom in Spain, and so he was ready to fight to hold on to Spain. Events were further complicated when one of the other barbarian tribes that was living in Spain at this time, and this is the Alans that I'm referring to here, the Alans end up losing their king, who was killed in a battle with the invading Romano-Gothic army. And it seems that the Alans didn't really have another candidate that would have been strong enough to lead their people in conflict with the Romans and Goths. And so what do? They turn to Gunderic, who, like I said, is king of the Vandals. And they say, hey, what if in addition to being king of the Vandals, we also make you king of the Alans? And so we merge our two armies to build an army that's going to be big enough to beat the Romans. Gunderic accepted. Gunderic obviously recognized the opportunity that this posed, and he may have figured that if he did incorporate the Alans into his army, he would have had a better chance of beating the Romans and their Gothic mercenaries. So Gunderic is now not only king of the Vandals, he is also king of the Alans, and he's got a mixed Vandal-Alan army that he was getting ready to face off against the Roman and Gothic force. The ultimate battle for the control of Spain finally happened in 422 AD when the Romano-Gothic force met the Vandal-Alan army outside the city of Cordoba in southern Hispania. The battle proved decisive, and the Vandal-Alan army was able to rout the Romano-Goths. By defeating the invading force, Gunderic secured Vandal control of Hispania. Unlike earlier Vandal kings, Gunderic preferred to administer his conquered territories rather than raid and pillage them. I don't mean that Gunderic was necessarily opposed to raiding and pillaging, because he still did quite a lot of raiding and pillaging, especially going after parts of Hispania that were outside his rule, raiding them for plunder, for extra supplies, for slaves. However, when it came to his own territory, Gunderic preferred to take over the Roman cities there and tax them rather than plunder them and destroy them. And so Gunderic would administer these cities in kind of a Roman fashion. He would collect taxes from the urban populace, and he would collect fees from trade. And in exchange, he would provide services, he would keep good order, he would protect these people from other hostile forces. This period of Vandal rule in Spain actually turned out to be rather prosperous, as there is archaeological evidence suggesting that people living in Vandal-ruled Spain in this period were reaping really good harvests, and that they continued to live in cities rather than flee to the countryside, which is a sign that things were relatively safe and prosperous compared to other parts of the empire where cities are emptying out because everybody's going to the countryside to try and find food. Unfortunately for Gunderic, he does make a big mistake in 428. What is this mistake, you ask? Well, Gunderic decides to start beefing with the Christian God. At least that's what the medieval chroniclers would have you believe. Remember, the Vandals are heretics. They are Arian Christians. They are not Nicene Christians. And as Arian Christians, the Vandals have no problem trying to seize the property of Nicene churches. They have no problem banning Nicene Christian bishops from preaching. They have no problem going after Nicene Christians at this time. And so in 428, Gunderic decided to try and seize the property of a church in Seville, a Nicene church in Seville. And the medieval chroniclers say that for his arrogance, for his heresy, the Christian god struck Gunderic down. In fact, they say that the Christian god sent a demon to kill the Vandal king. Now, is this what actually happened? We don't really know. This is the only account that we have of Gunderic's death. If you don't buy the idea of regicidal demons, you will unfortunately have to make your own educated guess as to what actually killed him. Maybe some kind of illness, maybe food poisoning. There were plenty of things going around in the ancient medieval world that could kill someone unexpectedly. Immediately after Gunderic's death, Gunderic's half-brother, who is a guy by the name of Genseric, or Genseric, I've seen it spelled both ways, was elected as the new king of the Vandals and Alans. Like I said, it does appear as Genseric, Genseric. People spell things differently. There's no dictionary in the ancient and medieval world, and so people aren't really checking on their grammar and their spelling to make sure that things are spelled like. And so you start to see some things that are just spelled wildly differently in the historical record. I'll call him Genseric for our purposes here. Now, Genseric was elected as the new king. What does it mean to be elected as a king in the 5th century? Well, you're not getting elected in any kind of modern election, right? It's not a popular democratic process. Who's participating in the election? Well, the Vandal elites, the heads of powerful Vandal families, Vandal landowners, maybe members of the clergy, are getting together and they're having a council, and they are going to try and come to a consensus on who the next king should be. They aren't really voting. It's more of a discussion, and the discussion ends when they kind of all agree on a candidate. They didn't just get to choose anyone, though. They actually would consider people who were members of the royal family. There did usually have to be some kind of blood relation to the next king. The thing that really does make this process stand out, though, is that they didn't necessarily pass things down to the oldest son of the last king all the time. In fact, there are quite a few instances where Germanic tribes that practice this kind of elective monarchy process, quite a few situations where rather than passing the throne to the king's oldest son, they would pass it to another male relative, like, for example, the king's uncle or the king's brother, which is what happens in this case with the Vandals. Well, why are they doing this? It's because sometimes you don't want to pass the leadership of your people to someone who might be young and inexperienced, especially because you see brothers of Germanic kings being very involved in helping kind of administer their brothers' lands and helping lead armies. And so you have a choice between, say, a 40-year-old tried and tested politician, military man, warrior, or a kid who could be as young as 1 or even 2 years old. Who are you going to pick to pass the throne to? Do you want to pass it to someone who's going to be dominated by a regent? Do you want to pass it to, a kid who's potentially in his late teens who might be an adult but hasn't necessarily proven himself? Or are you going to pass it to the guy who has proven himself, who has the proper credentials to really lead your people? You're going to pass it to that guy, right? And so we do see uncles and brothers kind of get chosen as kings, and a lot of sons are getting passed over. And this passing over of the last king's sons does sometimes lead to palace coups and civil wars in these Germanic tribes. And we'll be talking a little bit about why that doesn't happen with the Vandals. Spoiler alert, it's not for a super fun reason. If you are kind of stealing your nephew's birthright, you're probably not going to keep your nephews around for very long. That's all I'll say. So the Genseric is elected as the Vandal king, and he was chosen over Gunderic's 2 sons, both of whom were considered as being too young to rule. And so we are still quite a ways away from the concept of primogeniture. primogeniture is the kind of later medieval doctrine where the oldest son naturally inherits everything always, and that the oldest son's inheritance rights always trump everything else. As far as succession, that is not a thing that we are talking about yet. Unfortunately for the sons of Gunderic, who were passed over for the throne, Geseric did have them killed, so that rather than passing the throne back to his nephews, he could pass the Vandal throne to his own son. Geseric viewed the situation in Spain very differently than his brother Gunderic had, and this is because Geseric was very interested in the reports he was receiving of the prosperity of North Africa. Geseric has control of a lot of Spanish ports, and these Spanish ports are doing a lot of trade with North Africa. They may have even been importing grain from North Africa, and so Geseric starts getting into his head that, like, hey, this North Africa place sounds pretty awesome. It sounds like if I were to move there and take that over, I could be way wealthier, way more powerful, and also have way more grain, and I could sell that grain to the rest of the Roman world at a ridiculous profit. Geseric, as you will see throughout this episode, is a grade A opportunist. This guy never passes up on an opportunity to advance his own interest, to improve his power, to improve his security, and to improve his standing and prestige. And so when he sees an opportunity for advancement, he is going to leap on it. He's going to jump on that opportunity, and he's going to take full advantage of it. And it's actually this opportunism that has led many historians of the Vandal kings to say that Geseric was the best one. Geseric makes the most out of almost every situation that he faces, and it ends up strengthening his own position and strengthening the position of his people. It is also possible that the Roman governor of North Africa, a man by the name of Boniface, sent a letter to Geseric inviting him to settle in North Africa in exchange for Geseric's help in dealing with a rival Roman general by the name of Aetius. This claim, however, is rather dubious because almost as soon as Geseric landed in North Africa, Boniface marched his army out to meet him. So in 429 AD, somewhere between 20,000 and 100,000 Vandals crossed the Strait of Gibraltar into Morocco. We don't know the exact number. Obviously, that's a pretty big range, 20,000 to 100,000. Soon after the Vandals set foot in North Africa, the Roman governor Boniface prepared an army to repel them. Again, this undermines the idea that it was actually him who had invited the Vandals to come over in the first place. Had he invited them, he wouldn't have right away got an army ready to take them on. The Romans, however, were no match for the Vandal army, and the Vandal army actually destroys the army of Boniface and lays siege to the city of Hippo Regius. St. Augustine's account of the Vandal invasion paints a pretty bleak picture. You'll remember St. Augustine is the bishop of Hippo when the city is under siege. The Vandals are recorded as having been especially bloodthirsty towards Nicene Christians. We've talked a little bit about how the Vandals are Arians. If you want to learn more about the difference between the Arians and the Nicene Christians, check out the episode titled Nicaea to Chalcedon. The Vandals allegedly engaged in a systematic campaign of sexual violence against Nicene Christians, which greatly disturbed Augustine and his contemporaries. It is interesting that even back in the medieval period, people had a concept of acceptable tactics in war, acceptable uses of violence, and unacceptable uses of violence. The use of rape as a weapon of war was viewed as being unchristian, and therefore it did add something of a good versus evil dimension to this war between the Romans and the Vandals. And the Romans, of course, viewing themselves as being the civilized people fighting against the barbarian Vandals, also kind of heightened the biblical dimension to this conflict. These priests in North Africa wrote to Augustine asking him for advice on whether they should remain with their people and try to protect them from the Vandals or whether they should flee to save their own lives. And Augustine actually writes a letter telling them that the clergy should remain with their people so that if people are being killed by the Vandals, the clergy are available to administer the last rites and administer the sacraments. Augustine followed his own advice when the Vandals laid siege to Hippo. He did not abandon his city, he actually remained there. And so the Vandals cut off Hippo's food and water, but the city did manage to hold out for 14 months before the Vandals were finally forced to give up on the siege. They actually started running out of supplies. Unfortunately for St. Augustine, he did not live to see the Vandals retreat from his city, and it's likely that Augustine did pass away, and it's likely that he passed away either from stress, illness, or starvation, or maybe some combination of the three. Reading the letters St. Augustine wrote during the Vandal invasion can really put things in perspective for how just destructive this conflict was, how much of an impact it had on the people living in North Africa. Augustine had a tremendous responsibility for keeping the morale of his people up during what was a brutal siege. And one could say that Augustine was to the city of Hippo what someone like Winston Churchill was to the people of London during the Blitz, or maybe what Volodymyr Zelensky is to the people of Ukraine as they lived through the Russian war there. Augustine was more than a mere civic or religious leader, but he was also a moral leader, and it was his responsibility to keep the spirits and the morale of his people up as they underwent the siege. After lifting the siege, the Vandals pulled back from Hippo, and this gave Governor Boniface an opportunity to break out of Hippo and meet up with reinforcements that had been sent from the Eastern Roman Empire. As soon as the siege was lifted, Boniface took his soldiers and abandoned Hippo, and so the Vandals were just able to reoccupy Hippo, take it over, because the city had been left entirely undefended in 431 AD. Boniface, with a brand new army, decided to engage the Vandals outside of Hippo, only to be defeated and be forced to make a strategic retreat. Boniface was then recalled to Italy to deal with his old rival Aetius, leaving almost all of North Africa, with the key exception of Carthage, under Vandal rule. The Western Roman Emperor at this point is a young man named Valentinian III, who inherited the Roman throne when he was only 6 years old. For most of his reign, Valentinian was functionally a puppet for his mother, named Placidia, who acted as the regent. Valentinian was also bossed around by the Magister Militum, a general by the name of Felix. That is until 432, when Felix was killed by Aetius, Boniface's rival. Boniface was then recalled to Italy to deal with Aetius. That's why he was forced to leave North Africa with his army. He had to go deal with this brewing civil war. And Boniface actually defeated Aetius in battle, but Boniface himself was mortally wounded. And so that gave Aetius the opportunity to flee to the Huns. And Aetius actually lobbied the Huns to back him up in his play to become the next Magister Militum. And so once Aetius did make his way back into the empire, he became the de facto military dictator of the Western Empire for almost 2 decades. Aetius is like Genseric in a lot of ways. He's a grade A opportunist, and he is also relatively intelligent. He realized that the only way to really stabilize the Western Empire was to come to some sort of arrangement with the Vandals. And so Aetius is the first Roman leader that we see who is willing to kind of compromise Roman territory in order to secure a reprieve from Vandal attacks. So under pressure from Aetius, Valentinian III recognized the Vandals' right to rule North Africa. And in exchange, the Vandals paid tribute to the Romans, and Genseric sent his son to be a hostage at the Roman court in Ravenna. Genseric's son is named Huneric, by the way. For the first time in Roman-Vandal relations, the Romans were finally willing to grant the Vandals the formal recognition of their land that the Vandals had spent decades trying to achieve. Had the Romans granted the Vandals this formal recognition back when the Vandals were still in Spain, it's possible that the entire brutal North African campaign could have been avoided. It's particularly telling that the Vandal kings Gunderic and Genseric, even as they engaged in all-out warfare with the Romans, still cared deeply about receiving formal recognition from the Roman court. They saw Roman approval as key to their legitimacy, which does make a certain degree of sense when you consider that they were conquering and ruling over vast swaths of Roman territory, and they did need some way to prove to the Roman citizens living there that they were more than unwashed barbarian invaders, that they actually had a right to rule and a right to administer their new territory. The Vandals, in effect, needed to convince these Roman citizens that they could rule effectively, and getting the official stamp of approval from the Western Emperor was a good way to do that. Gesseric, however, wasn't content with the land that he had won in the settlement with Valentinian III. He set up his capital in the city of Hippo, but he had his sights set on the ancient city of Carthage, which, although it was in North Africa, was still under Roman control. Now, Carthage is one of the oldest and most important cities in the ancient world. The Carthaginian Empire was the main rival to the Roman Empire until the Roman victory in the Third Punic War, which ended with the destruction of Old Carthage. The Romans, however, rebuilt Carthage, and over time it became a thriving trade hub due to its optimal position on the Mediterranean coast. Grain would travel from across North Africa to Carthage, where it would then be shipped throughout the empire. So Carthage is one of the two most important ports for these grain shipments, the other being the Egyptian city of Alexandria. Gesseric wanted Carthage, and he wanted it bad, not just because of the economic significance of the city, but also because conquering the ancient capital of one of the world's greatest former empires would cement his legitimacy as the rightful ruler of the Vandals, Alans, and the Romans living in North Africa. So even as Gesseric was making peace with the Romans, it seems he had no intention of upholding it in the long term. He really did want Carthage to be the capital of his new kingdom, and he was determined to get it. So he conducted a peace with the Romans in hopes of getting some breathing room before he began his next campaign, and the Romans, who had plenty of their own problems at this time, were all too happy to comply. So, for a period of about 3 years, Gesseric geared up for another war. He began raising funds by confiscating the property of Nicene churches, and he hired the shipbuilders of Hippo to build him a navy. And I am talking about a rather substantial navy. There weren't a lot of naval forces in the Mediterranean at this time, and so anybody who's engaging in a large buildup is naturally going to become really powerful because there is something of a power vacuum going on. The only force that can really rival the Vandal Navy at this point is the Eastern Roman Navy, but the Eastern Roman Navy is often too busy dealing with their own problems to really challenge the Vandals. Gesseric, somewhere along the way, decided that the best way to exert his power over the whole Mediterranean was to embark on something of a pirate career. And what I mean by this is that Gesseric realized that the Roman Navy was in no state to really police the Mediterranean, and so that he came to believe that if he had enough ships, he could attack Roman coastal settlements, raid them, take all their stuff, take people captive, and then sail away before the Roman army had time to mobilize and respond. We don't know whether the Romans knew what Gesseric was up to, though I tend to think that if they did, they would have made some effort to prevent him from building up his navy. However, it is possible that the Roman state was simply so disorganized at this point that even if they knew that Gesseric was building up his naval force, they simply were in no position to do anything about it. Things finally came to a head in 439 AD, only 4 years after the Vandal-Roman peace treaty was signed. Once again, Gesseric had waited for the perfect opportunity to strike, and the year 439 was exactly the right moment. And that's because the military dictator of the West, Aetius, had effectively pulled all of his forces out of North Africa to deal with the Visigoths and the Burgundians in Gaul, both of whom had rebelled against the Romans. Gesseric conducted a surprise attack on Carthage in October 439, and he took the city with very little struggle. With access to Carthage's port and massive shipbuilding industry, he immediately began to bolster his fleet, and he actually started hiring Roman sailors. It was clear that Gesseric was preparing for a big move, though at the time no one really knew what exactly he was planning. Still, Gesseric's attack on Carthage freaked the Romans out, and they began preparing for a maritime invasion of Italy. They were afraid that Gesseric would sail to Italy and attack the great Italian cities like Rome and Ravenna. Aetius was recalled from the war in Gaul to begin preparing Italy for war. But Gesseric, again, was a smart guy, and he realized that if the Romans were preparing central Italy for war, then he should attack where the Romans weren't prepared. And so instead of attacking mainland Italy, Gesseric decided to sail to Sicily, which the Romans were not prepared for, and the Vandals took real advantage of that. And so they captured Sicilian cities, they plundered other Sicilian cities, and they even made their way into southern Italy. Why were the Vandals so intent on continuing to attack the Romans? Well, the Vandals as a Germanic tribe had something of a warrior culture, which meant that young Vandal men wanted a chance to prove themselves in battle, and who better to prove yourself against than the Romans? Gesseric also knew that the more plunder and loot that he sees, the more warriors he'd be able to hire and keep employed. So he was effectively building a pirate state that was fueled on the one hand by the taxes he collected from the North African grain trade, and fueled on the other hand by the plunder that he seized in his attacks on Roman settlements. And then he would dole that plunder out to his greatest warriors, and in this way he would attract the best and brightest warriors from around the Mediterranean world to come and work for him. The Western Romans were so intent on protecting Italy that they did not have the willingness nor the means to make a direct attack on the Vandal territory in North Africa. The Eastern Romans, however, were in a much stronger position. If you'd like to learn more about why the Eastern Empire was able to maintain its integrity while the Western Empire was falling apart, check out the earlier episode titled New Rome Who Dis. In 440, the Eastern Emperor Theodosius II prepared his navy to make an attack on Vandal North Africa. Theodosius seems to have realized that if something wasn't done about these Vandals, then they would be allowed to run amok throughout the Mediterranean world. It's also possible that Theodosius saw an opportunity to take the Vandals out and seize control of the North African grain trade, which had previously been controlled by the Western Romans, and then he could bring it solidly under Eastern Roman control. Even though the Western and Eastern Romans were supposed to work together, there was still a little bit of territorialism going on. And honestly, if I were Theodosius II, if I were the Eastern Emperor at this point, I would think that everybody in the West was frankly incompetent and that they were letting the empire go to crap and that somebody needed to step in. So the Emperor Theodosius II, who was literally the adult in the room since the Emperor Valentinian is still pretty young, decided to step in and do something about these Vandals. So in 441 AD, the Eastern Roman navy set sail for Sicily with 1,000 ships and an army of between 15 and 20,000 men. For about 2 seconds, things were looking pretty rough for the Vandals. The Eastern Roman military was very strong, very disciplined. They could have presented a real threat for Gesseric. And the Vandals actually caught a lucky break because almost as soon as the Eastern Romans landed in Sicily, the Eastern Roman Empire was attacked simultaneously by the Persians and the Huns. So as soon as the Eastern Romans got to Sicily, they had to pack up, turn around, and head back to protect Eastern Roman territory from the Huns and the Persians. Once again, the Western Romans were on their own, with no way to beat the Vandals or to force them out of Sicily. Valentinian III had no choice but to conduct another humiliating peace deal with Gesseric, and in this deal, he pretty much recognized Gesseric's dominion over North Africa, Sicily, and a few smaller Mediterranean islands. In exchange, Gesseric promised to continue selling North African grain to Italy, for which he got paid huge sums of Roman gold. After the peace deal of 442 AD, Gesseric was the undisputed master of the Mediterranean. No other power could rival his massive pirate fleet, which meant that whenever he was short on cash, Gesseric could sail his army to a wealthy Roman settlement and steal all their stuff. Thus, the ancient Roman concept of Mare Nostrum, Latin for our sea, which symbolized Roman control over the Mediterranean, was actually taken over by the Vandals. The Romans lost their dominion over the Mediterranean to the Vandals, and in effect, this made Gesseric one of the most powerful Mediterranean rulers who really could only be challenged by the Eastern Romans. Although, like I said, the Eastern Romans tended to be way too busy with their own problems to really go after Gesseric. Gesseric had robbed the Western Roman Empire of one of its most valuable provinces. The Western Roman state, which was practically insolvent at this point, had to shell out huge sums of cash to purchase grain from the Vandals instead of just getting the grain for free, and so this presented a real challenge for them. Even while Gesseric paid lip service to his peace treaty with the Western Romans, he still allowed his fleet to conduct minor pirate operations on Roman and barbarian cities alike. The Western Romans seemed not to mind this too much because they knew that if they engaged in open hostilities with Gesseric, he would simply cut off their grain supply. Gesseric, frankly, had Valentinian III by the balls, and he had no intention of easing up on that pressure. Now that Gesseric had secured control over North Africa, let's talk about the kingdom that he set up there. It's often called the Vandal Kingdom of North Africa. That's how historians refer to it. First, let's talk about the demographics. Historians have a hard time describing Vandal identity at this point, and that's because the so-called Vandal army was really made up of a whole bunch of different tribes. We've talked about the Vandals and the Alans, who were the larger of the two groups, but there do seem to have also been a Gothic component of this army. There may have been some Burgundians and a few smaller tribal groups represented as well. So when I refer to the quote-unquote Vandal army, I'm really referring more to a mixed tribal army made up of smaller groups that was led by the Vandal royal family. Adding to the confusion, the Vandal army took over an area already populated by Roman citizens, some of whom may have had Italian heritage, Greek heritage, or most especially Berber heritage. So the Vandals have effectively taken over a rather diverse polyglot state. Despite the diversity of their ethno-linguistic backgrounds, however, the Roman citizens of the Vandal kingdom shared knowledge of either Greek or Latin, and they had a shared identity as Roman citizens. This presented a unique problem for Gesseric, as he had to effectively prove to these ex-Roman citizens that he could rule them effectively. So rather than get rid of the Roman administration, Gesseric co-opted it. The Vandals adopted Latin as the language of governance, and they worked with local Roman administrators to collect taxes and maintain infrastructure. The Vandals started producing artwork that blended Roman traditions with Vandal ones, and it seems that Gesseric and his successors began to dress themselves like Roman emperors. Gesseric in particular seems to have wanted to emulate the greatness of the Roman Empire, and so he very consciously tried to appear as a Roman-style ruler, very much as a Roman client king. In fact, Gesseric went so far as to betroth his son Huneric to the Emperor Valentinian's daughter, in effect marrying his family into the imperial Roman family. Other Vandals followed in Gesseric's footsteps. It seems the Vandals really believed in the benefits of classical Roman culture and civilization, and so we see Vandal elites hiring Roman teachers to give their children classical Roman educations. Like their king, the Vandals began to adopt Latin as their primary language. Contrary to popular belief, the Vandals never really wanted to destroy Roman civilization or get rid of Roman culture. They merely wanted to adapt it and make it their own. Now, despite the fact that the Vandals and Romans were living side by side in North Africa, it was clear that the Vandals were fully in charge. Gesseric stripped the old Roman elites of their estates, and he actually doled those estates out to his best warriors. The Romans who lost their estates to the Vandals tended to flee to Italy. We do have some who turned up as far away as Syria in the Eastern Empire. While Roman citizens were instrumental to Vandal administration, that didn't change the fact that they were working for a foreign invader king. You have to remember, a lot of these people still had memories of the Vandal attack, and so some of them were probably very traumatized by this idea of Vandal control over North Africa. Roman citizens were also barred from serving in the Vandal army, although they were allowed to serve in the navy, which suggests that the Vandals did need a little bit of Roman expertise to operate their naval enterprise. One historian I read described Vandal-Roman relations in the Vandal kingdom as being something like a caste system, with Romans being placed fully in service to the Vandal elite, but this is honestly a little bit of a stretch. Roman citizens living in the Vandal kingdom did tend to have relatively safer and better lives than many Roman citizens living in the Western Empire, and that's because, unlike the Western Roman Empire, the Vandals could actually protect and maintain law and order in their kingdom. The Vandals weren't as abusive as they could have been, and they certainly weren't necessarily as offensive to the Romans as some of the other barbarian invaders were, like the Huns or the Persians. Now, this isn't to say that life was dandy in the Vandal kingdom. Like I said, everybody there was pretty seriously traumatized by the rapine and plunder that the Vandals had carried out. On the other hand, the Vandal kings were absolutely intolerant of Nicene Christianity. Only Arian Christians were allowed to serve in government, and Gesseric would regularly go after Nicene churches and confiscate their property. Now, the situation was manageable under Gesseric. Nicene churches could lose their property, but Nicene Christians weren't being forced to necessarily convert to Arian Christianity. Things started to change once Gesseric's son Huneric took the throne, and we'll talk a lot about Huneric's persecution of Nicene Christianity in part 2, which is our next episode. Now, let's get to the moment that you have all been waiting for. It's time to talk about the Vandal Sack of Rome. Vandal-Roman relations stabilized thanks to the Western Empire's total unwillingness to challenge the Vandal pirates, as well as the betrothal of the Vandal prince Huneric and the Roman princess Eudocia. However, things took a rather dark turn in 454 AD when a Roman senator by the name of Petronius Maximus convinced Emperor Valentinian that Aetius, the Magister Militum, was plotting against him. Remember, as Magister Militum, Aetius was practically the military dictator of the Western Empire. Valentinian could have been little more than a figurehead here, and so this puts Valentinian in a really weak position, especially if Aetius ever decided to try and overthrow him. So Valentinian, who had spent his whole life being pushed around by regents and military generals like Aetius, had enough, and so he personally murdered Aetius with his own sword, all at the urging of Petronius Maximus. Then Petronius Maximus turned around, went to some of Aetius's soldiers, and he said, "Hey, guess who I just watched murder your beloved commander, the Emperor Valentinian?" The soldiers reacted by walking straight into the imperial palace seeking to avenge Aetius, and they actually assassinated Valentinian. There was a little bit of an interregnum here. There was no clear successor to the Western Roman throne, as Valentinian had no sons. Rather than pass the Western throne to the Eastern Emperor, Theodosius II, which is really what they should have done in this situation, the Western Roman Senate took huge bribes from Petronius Maximus, and they declared him the new emperor. Maximus forcibly married Valentinian's widow, and this did grant him kind of a tenuous tie to the imperial Roman family. Maximus then made a huge mistake. And what he does is he actually cancels the betrothal between Jeseric's son and Valentinian's daughter. And Maximus actually forced Valentinian's daughter Eudocia to marry his own son. Well, why did he do this? It's possible that he genuinely believed that it was more important to shore up his claim to the throne by marrying into the imperial Roman family. He may have been trying to prevent Theodosius II from making his own claim on the Western Roman throne. It is also possible that Maximus underestimated the prowess of the Vandals, and you do have to remember that many Romans still wrote the Vandals off as barbarians and didn't necessarily take them seriously and recognize the threat that they posed. Jeseric was a Germanic warrior king, which means he took honor very seriously. And so he took the breaking off of the betrothal between Eudocia and Huneric as a personal insult. It didn't help that Maximus had effectively foiled Jeseric's ambitions of marrying into the Roman imperial family. According to one account, it was actually Valentinian's widow, Eudocia, different from Eudocia, who actually asked Jeseric to help her get vengeance on Maximus by attacking Italy. Is this story true? I don't know. It does sound a little bit melodramatic, but if my husband had just been murdered and the guy who did the murdering had forced me to marry him, I'd probably do something just as drastic. So this story could be possible. It is melodramatic, but it has a little bit of, feasibility to it. Whether he acted on Eudocia's invitation or not, Jeseric began preparing his fleet to sail for Italy. This time, the Vandals would not be content with Sicily or any of the smaller outlying islands. They were seeking vengeance, which meant they had their sights set on the eternal city of Rome. In 455, Jeseric's army landed at the mouth of the Tiber River, just a few miles away from Rome's walls. Upon hearing of the arrival of the Vandal army, the people of Rome set upon their new emperor, Maximus, and stoned him to death. In the surrounding political chaos, Rome was left undefended. The Roman military was stationed on the frontiers, and so Rome was relatively undefended. And by the time the Eastern Roman court got word of the Vandal attack, it was far too late for them to do anything about it. As Jeseric approached Rome, he met with the city's lead bishop, Pope Leo the Great. This is the same Pope Leo that convinced Attila the Hun not to attack Rome only a few years earlier, and it seems that Leo thought that he could at least convince Jeseric not to go overboard with his attack on Rome. While Jeseric would not spare Rome, he did promise to maintain good order during his occupation of the city, and he forbade his men from lighting fires or torturing captives. Leo probably realized this was the best he could get out of the Vandal king, and Jeseric, for his part, seems to have honored his word. How Leo was able to extract these concessions from Gesseric is unknown, though historians think that even though Gesseric was an Arian Christian and Leo was a Nicene Christian, Gesseric still respected Leo as the heir of St. Peter, and Gesseric may have feared angering the Christian god by offending the Pope. The Vandal army entered Rome and occupied the city for 2 weeks. Gesseric was probably keenly aware that he could not hold the city should the Western Roman army return from the frontier, or should the Eastern Romans sail their navy over to Italy. So he made the smart call. He would punish the Romans for breaking his trust, but he would not try to hold on to the city permanently. So Gesseric ordered his men to begin a comprehensive search of the city. They took anything of value they could get their hands on. They also took many Romans as slaves, capturing anyone that they thought had valuable skills or whose family was wealthy enough to pay a ransom. The most egregious act of theft was when Vandal soldiers tore the bronze roof tiles off of the temple to Jupiter. Now, Enlightenment-era historians would have you believe that the Vandal army just absolutely tore through Rome and they destroyed everything they could get their hands on, but this simply isn't true. According to analysis conducted by Professor Michel Salzman, the Vandal sack was about as orderly as a sack of a city could be. The Vandals conducted a thorough search of the city, and once they thought that they had taken everything of value, they took off. They didn't destroy any buildings, they didn't light fires, and they didn't really destroy Roman infrastructure, with the sole exception of destroying some aqueducts to make it easier for them to take over the city. It is telling that Rome recovered fairly quickly from the Vandal sack, which suggests that it wasn't as destructive as some people would have you believe. So, did the Vandals destroy Rome? Not really, but they did take a whole lot of Roman shit and a whole lot of Roman people captive. The lucky captives would be those with families or friends wealthy enough to ransom them. The Christian church was also involved in paying the ransoms of Nicene Christians. The unlucky captives would be those without families who could afford that ransom, and they would be forced to live out the rest of their lives as slaves to the Vandals, being put to work without any pay or hope of rescue. Okay, we are going to stop there today with the Vandals having successfully sacked Rome. This episode is shaping up to be one of the longer episodes we've done, which is why we're going to return to the Vandals next week with a part 2, in which we'll cover the history of the Vandals from the end of the sack of Rome to the beginning of the Byzantine Vandal War in 533 AD. I began this episode by posing the question of whether the Vandals deserve their reputation as ruthless, vandalizing barbarians. While it is true that the Vandals committed what we'd consider to be war crimes in North Africa, it is also true that they weren't necessarily waging war in a more brutal fashion than any of the other barbarians or even the Romans themselves. There wasn't really a concept of war crimes in the ancient world, and so warfare did tend to be pretty brutal. Still, the Vandals terrified the Roman world, as anyone who's read St. Augustine's account of the North African conflict will know. The fear and vitriol that Roman people like Augustine felt practically rises off the page. Still, the idea that the Vandals destroyed the city of Rome is a little overblown. There were no fires, and the Vandals didn't engage in any kind of mass slaughter of the population. However, they did take a huge amount of the Roman population captive, which could explain why the Vandal sack is remembered as being so destructive. The real challenge that the Vandals posed for the Roman Empire wasn't in destroying the city of Rome, it was the fact that they took over the North African grain trade and effectively seized control of Italy's food supply. That's really the thing they did that brought the Roman Empire to its knees, and it was that act that effectively crippled the Western Roman Empire and set it on a path of serious decline. So, what's your opinion? Do you think the Vandals deserve their Enlightenment-era reputation as being ruthless, destructive barbarians, or do you think the Vandals were just doing what any army in this period of ancient history would do? If you have an opinion, you should let me know in the comments of whatever platform you're listening on. As always, you can leave feedback about the show in the comments or by visiting the podcast website, which is linked in the show notes. You can also take a look at my bibliography on the website. I highly recommend taking a look at Dr. Michel Salzman's book titled The Falls of Rome, which was really helpful in determining the scale and severity of the Vandal attack on Rome. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week for part 2 of our series on the Vandals.